Welcome back, everybody, to the deep dive. We are diving into something today that I think we all wish we were better at,
Yeah,
learning faster.
definitely.
You've sent in tons of research and articles and just stuff from all over about this. And clearly, you're serious about leveling up your learning game,
Yeah, it seems to be a popular topic.
for sure. Even just skimming through some of these, I've learned some surprising things.
Yeah, it's a really fascinating field because it kind of pulls from so many different areas.
Right.
Cognitive science and psychology, but then even like time management and productivity hacking.
Totally.
It's really not just about cramming a bunch of facts in your head. It's understanding how to use your brain most effectively.
Exactly. So before we even get to the really good stuff, let's do some myth busting.
Yeah.
This Article 9 Awesome Accelerated Learning Techniques kind of goes right for it and says some of our most common study habits are actually holding us back.
Yeah.
Were you surprised by any of these?
I think the one that always throws people off is the like highlighting and rereading.
Right.
Because most of us have done that for years,
Oh, yeah.
assuming that it's helpful, but it can really be detrimental if you're doing it passively.
I am so guilty of that.
Yeah.
I thought I was being so diligent, but now I realize I was probably just, like you said, passively, like kind of tricking myself into thinking I was doing something.
Exactly.
But this article does say even highlighting can be useful, right?
Yeah, the key is to make it an active process.
Okay.
You're not just like mindlessly going through and highlighting text. Think of it more as like
Right.
you're flagging information for later for like active recall.
Yeah, good.
So for example, you could highlight keywords or concepts, but then you challenge yourself to define them from memory without looking back at the text.
Oh,
Or they mention this technique called the marginalia dot technique,
so
which is basically putting a dot next to key information. And then later on, you try to recall what that refers to using that dot as a visual cue.
oh, that's interesting.
So you're really turning your notes into an active recall tool.
So it's about using those highlights more strategically, almost like creating your own little pop quiz
Exactly.
for later on. But let's talk more about active recall in general, because it seems to be like the hero
Yeah?
in a lot of these articles.
Yeah, for sure.
Why is it so powerful?
The science behind it is pretty interesting, basically. When you force your brain to retrieve information,
Okay.
you're strengthening those neural pathways that are associated with that information. So it's like exercising a muscle.
Okay.
The more you use it, the stronger it gets. And that act of struggling to recall something actually makes it more likely that you'll remember it long term.
It's almost counterintuitive, right?
Yeah.
You would think that just reading something over and over
Right.
would be enough. But all this research is suggesting that making your brain work a little harder in the process
Yeah.
actually helps you retain it better.
Exactly. And think about it like, if you're trying to learn a new language and you're just passively listening to audio,
Right.
you might pick up on some vocabulary, but you're never going to become fluent. But if you're actively engaged in conversations, even if you're making mistakes and stumbling, you're forcing your brain to work harder,
Right.
and that leads to fluency.
Gotcha.
So it's that same principle applied to any kind of learning.
So what are some of the best ways to incorporate active recall? Because we see a lot of things here,
Right.
like testing yourself, teaching the material Feynman technique. Like, where do we even begin?
So a great starting point, I think, is self-testing, and it doesn't have to be super formal.
Okay.
It could be as simple as reading a chapter and then closing the book, trying to summarize the key points from memory, or using flashcards.
Okay.
But instead of just passively flipping through them, actually try to recall the answer before you look at it, even pretending to teach the material to like an imaginary audience.
Oh, right. Like explaining it to someone who's never heard it?
Exactly.
Right.
It can be really helpful.
So we've talked a lot about what's happening inside our heads, but our environment plays a role too.
Yeah, for sure.
Right. These articles talk about minimizing distractions, getting physical movement, even changing study spots. Why are those things important?
So our brains are incredibly complex, but they're also really easily overwhelmed.
Okay.
So if you're trying to learn something new, but you're also checking your phone and listening to music and thinking about your to-do list,
Right.
your brain's going to struggle to process that information effectively,
So it's like trying to run a marathon while juggling.
pretty much.
You're not going to do either very well.
Not a recipe for success.
Not at all. But you mentioned physical movement too. How does that play into it?
There's actually a lot of research showing that physical activity is really good for your cognitive function.
Okay.
It improves blood flow to the brain, increases something called BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor,
Okay.
which is essential for growing new brain cells. And can even enhance your cognitive flexibility and memory.
So we're not just talking about clearing our desks and silencing our phones,
Right.
but actually getting up and moving. This Article 9 Awesome Accelerated Learned Techniques
Mm-hmm.
actually suggests turning a walk between study locations into a memory palace journey.
Yeah.
What does that even mean?
So the memory palace technique, it's a really powerful mnemonic device.
Okay.
It involves associating information with specific locations within a familiar space, so like your home
Right.
or a walking route.
Okay.
So imagine you're studying for a history exam,
Okay.
and you need to remember a series of events as you're walking from your house to the library. You can mentally place each of those events at a specific landmark along the way.
So you're mentally putting these historical events at your neighbor's mailbox, the stop sign, the park bench.
Exactly.
Okay.
And then when you retrace your steps, you know those landmarks are going to prompt you to recall that information.
So even something as simple as a daily walk can become a learning opportunity.
Exactly. And that physical act of walking can enhance that encoding process, making it more likely that you'll remember the information later.
This is blowing my mind. We're only scratching the surface here, but I already see how much potential there is.
Yeah.
And we haven't even talked about sleep or focus or, the whole learning styles debate.
There's so much more to explore. We really haven't even touched on how to optimize our environment, how to hack our brain's natural rhythms, and how to really tap into our own individual strengths.
I'm ready. Let's go.
Let's do it.
Now I'm ready to get into some more advanced techniques.
Let's do it.
You mentioned something earlier called the Feynman technique.
Oh, yeah.
What makes it so special?
The Feynman technique is all about simplifying and clarifying. It's named after the famous physicist Richard Feynman, who was brilliant at, breaking down these really complex ideas into something that anyone could understand.
Right.
It's built on the idea that if you can't explain something simply, you don't truly understand it.
That makes so much sense.
Yeah.
It's like the ultimate test of knowledge.
Exactly.
Can you teach it to someone else?
And it's a 4-step process.
Okay.
So first, you choose the concept you want to learn, and then you pretend to teach it to someone with no prior knowledge.
Okay.
This forces you to identify the gaps in your understanding.
Gotcha.
And if you get stuck, you go back to the source material and fill those gaps. And finally, you refine your explanation until it's like as clear and concise as possible.
I love how actionable this is.
Yeah.
It's not just like a vague concept. It's like a step-by-step
Totally.
work that anyone can use.
For sure.
It seems like it'd be super helpful for like those subjects that just like
Absolutely.
make your head spin.
Like, if you're trying to understand a complex scientific theory or, a philosophical argument,
Right.
by breaking it down and explaining it in simple terms, you not only solidify your own understanding,
Right.
but you make it accessible to others.
Another concept that kind of caught my eye is desirable difficulty.
Yeah,
Seems like a paradox,
a little bit.
but I'm intrigued. What's the logic behind making learning more challenging?
So think about it this way. If something is too easy, our brains tend to tune out.
Right.
We're not really engaging deeply, and so the information doesn't stick.
Okay.
But then on the flip side, if something is too hard, we get frustrated and give up.
Right.
So desirable difficulty is about finding that sweet spot where our brains are engaged,
Okay.
but not overwhelmed.
So it's like the Goldilocks zone.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Not too hard, not too soft.
That's right.
Right.
What are some ways to create this desirable difficulty?
So we already touched on spaced repetition, which is a fantastic technique for introducing desirable difficulty. Okay. So instead of cramming information all at once, you're spreading it out over time, gradually increasing those intervals between review sessions.
I've dabbled with some space repetition apps before,
Yeah.
and it's amazing how much more I retain when I revisit the material at those times.
Totally.
You also mentioned something called interleaving,
Right.
which sounds counterintuitive.
It does.
Why would mixing up different subjects be helpful?
So interleaving might seem less efficient on the surface,
Okay.
but it forces your brain to make connections between different concepts.
Okay.
So think of it like cross-training for your brain.
I like that.
Keeps things fresh, engages different cognitive muscles, and it strengthens the overall network of knowledge.
So, for example, if you're studying math, history, and Spanish,
Yeah,
you could rotate between those instead of
exactly.
doing a big chunk of one.
Exactly.
Okay, that's interesting.
Yeah, so it really is a mental agility workout.
It is. And it seems like this kind of goes with that broader theme that we've been talking about. Speed learning isn't about these shortcuts or magic tricks. It's about understanding
Yeah,
how our brains work best and working with them, not against them.
absolutely. It's about leveraging that incredible power of our brain and really optimizing the way we process and retain information.
Now, one thing I wanted to bring up that kind of ties into this whole idea of optimizing your approach
Mm.
is like mentors and coaches.
Yeah,
A lot of these articles talk about how valuable that can be
for
to
sure.
have someone kind of guiding you through.
Yeah, it's like having that personalized feedback and guidance.
Totally, like having a learning Sherpa
Totally.
to help you navigate the terrain and avoid any pitfalls.
Exactly.
But not everyone has access to that.
Right.
So what about those of us going at it alone?
So even if you don't have a formal mentor, there are ways to find that kind of support.
Okay.
So you could study the work of like top performers in your field,
Sure.
deconstruct their techniques and try to emulate those approaches. There's also, countless online communities and forums where people share learning tips and strategies.
That's a good idea.
Yeah.
That's empowering.
Yeah.
That means we don't have to reinvent the wheel.
Exactly.
We can learn from people who have already achieved
Right.
what we're trying to achieve.
For sure.
I think that's a great segue into the physical side of things.
Yeah.
We often think of learning as purely mental,
Right.
but these sources talk about nutrition and exercise.
Yeah.
Can certain foods actually make us learn faster?
There's a growing body of research that highlights the link between diet and cognitive function.
Okay.
So, for example, omega-3 fatty acids, which are found in oily fish, and some plant-based sources are essential for brain health, and they've been linked to improved memory and learning.
So like salmon.
Salmon, exactly.
Okay.
Also, antioxidants, which are found in colorful fruits and vegetables, protect your brain from damage and enhance cognitive performance.
So a diet rich in those things can actually help
Yeah.
us learn faster.
It can give you a learning edge.
What about exercise?
Yeah.
We all know it's good for our bodies, but how does it benefit our brains?
So exercise has a profound impact on brain function. It improves blood flow to the brain, increases that production of BDNF,
Right?
and it enhances cognitive flexibility and memory.
Wow, so that morning run or yoga session is like a turbo boost
Pretty much.
for our brains.
Exactly.
I'm starting to see how all these pieces kind of fit together.
Yeah.
Speed learning isn't about cramming facts, it's about creating that holistic environment
Right.
that supports that optimal learning both mentally and physically.
It's about treating our brain with the same care and attention that we give to our physical bodies.
Right?
And when we do that, the results can be astonishing.
So we've covered a lot of ground.
We have.
Feynman technique to desirable difficulty,
Yeah.
mentoring nutrition exercise.
A lot to take in.
It is a lot to process what happens when we hit those inevitable learning plateaus.
Yeah.
How do we kind of overcome those moments of frustration and keep moving forward?
So learning plateaus, they're a natural part of the process.
Okay.
And they can be so frustrating. But it's important to remember that they often signal that your brain is consolidating information and preparing for that next leap forward.
Okay.
So sometimes the best thing you can do is actually take a break.
Okay.
Step away from the material
Oh,
and let your brain process things in the background.
that's reassuring.
Yeah.
Like giving our brains a rest stop
Exactly.
on this road trip.
Exactly.
But what if we just feel stuck, like we don't know
Right.
how to get back on track?
So one approach is to break down that skill or concept you're learning into smaller, more manageable sub-skills.
Okay.
This can make the task feel less daunting and allow you to really focus on mastering one element at a time.
Okay.
Another technique is to just change your approach.
Okay.
If you've been using the same study methods and they're not working,
Right.
it might be time to experiment with something new.
So being flexible,
Exactly.
adaptable,
Absolutely.
and not being afraid to shake things up
Yeah,
if it's not working.
exactly.
It's inspiring to think that we have so much control over our learning.
We really do. That's the beauty of it.
Yeah.
It empowers us to take ownership of our learning, to experiment, to find what works best for us, and to just continuously push ourselves to new heights.
Oh. Well, this has been an incredible deep dive so far.
Yeah.
We've explored so many fascinating techniques and strategies
For sure.
for maximizing our learning potential.
Absolutely.
But the big question remains, how do we make all this stick?
Right.
How do we actually integrate it into our lives? and make speed learning a habit?
The million-dollar question.
We'll tackle that and more in part 3 of this deep dive. Welcome back to the deep dive. We've spent the last 2 parts exploring all these speed learning techniques.
Yeah.
Active recall, spaced repetition, Feynman technique, desirable difficulty.
That's a lot.
It's a lot to take in.
Yeah.
So now the question is, how do we make this stick?
Right.
It's one thing to understand it, but how do we actually use it in our lives?
Yeah, that's the real challenge, right?
Exactly.
It's like knowledge without application, you know. It's like a car without an engine. It has potential, but it can't actually go anywhere.
Good.
But the good news is it's not as daunting as it might seem to turn these techniques into habits.
Okay.
The key is to just start small and build momentum gradually.
I'm all about starting small
Mm-hmm.
because it's so easy to get overwhelmed
Right.
when you try to change too much at once.
Exactly.
So where do we even begin?
So instead of trying to overhaul your entire learning approach overnight,
Okay.
pick one technique that really resonates with you
Okay.
and commit to practicing it consistently for a week or 2.
Okay.
So for example, if you're someone who really struggles with distractions,
Right.
maybe your first habit is to create a dedicated study space and silence your phone.
Okay.
Or if you're someone who's constantly forgetting what you read,
Yeah.
maybe you start with a simple active recall technique, like summarizing each paragraph in your own words.
So it's about picking one that's really going to target your specific problem
Exactly.
and make that part of your routine.
Yeah, make it a non-negotiable.
Okay. And then once that's comfortable, you can add in more.
Exactly. Think of it like building a muscle. You wouldn't start weight training by trying to bench press your maximum weight on day 1.
Right.
You would start with lighter weights and gradually increase the intensity over time.
Okay. I like that analogy.
Yeah.
Makes it seem much more attainable.
Totally.
But let's be real. Motivation comes and goes.
It does.
We're not going to want to do this every day.
Yeah, for sure.
How do we stay motivated and hold ourselves accountable?
So one really powerful strategy is to set clear and specific goals for what you want to achieve with your learning.
Okay.
So instead of just saying, I want to learn Spanish,
Right.
get specific. Maybe it's, I want to be able to have a basic conversation in Spanish by my trip to Spain next year.
Okay.
Having that tangible goal in mind gives you something to work towards.
Right.
And helps you track your progress.
Goals are so important, they give you a destination.
Right, exactly.
And that roadmap of how to get there.
And it's not just about that end goal. It's also about celebrating those small wins along the way.
Yes.
Did you stick to your study schedule for a whole week?
Right.
That's a win.
That's huge.
Did you explain a complex concept to someone else using the Feynman technique? Another win?
Right.
These small wins add up
They do.
and create that positive feedback loop that keeps you motivated.
What about support? We talked
Yeah.
about mentors and coaches earlier.
Right.
But even just having a learning buddy or group
Totally.
can be helpful.
There's so much power in shared learning experiences,
Yeah.
Finding a learning buddy or joining a community allows you to share your goals, discuss challenges, celebrate successes, and keep each other accountable.
Yeah.
It creates that sense of shared purpose and helps you stay motivated when those inevitable dips in enthusiasm hit.
It's like a cheerleading squad for
Exactly.
your learning journey.
I love that.
But I think it's important to remember, too, that learning should be enjoyable.
Oh, for sure.
We're talking about speed and efficiency, but we can get caught up in the race and lose sight
Absolutely.
of the joy of learning.
Speed learning isn't about turning ourselves into learning robots.
Right.
It's about finding ways to make learning more enjoyable, engaging, and rewarding.
Right.
It's about embracing curiosity, exploring new ideas, and really pushing those boundaries of our knowledge.
So it's not just about the destination. It's about enjoying the journey.
Exactly.
That's a great way to wrap up this deep dive.
It is.
We've uncovered all these techniques for unlocking our learning potential.
We have.
But the real key is to find what works for you.
For sure.
Embrace the process and never stop learning and growing.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Well, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the world of speed learning.
Yeah, this was fun.
I hope you learned something that's going to help you learn faster and smarter, and maybe even have some fun along the way. Until next time, happy learning.